I didn't even see it coming. One second, I was standing in the hallway, listening to my parents and brother argue about the house in Maine. The next, I was flat on the floor, the world around me shattering into a million pieces. The sound of glass breaking was a crescendo that drowned out all the voices, all the anger, all the unspoken words. It was the loudest sound I had ever heard. A final, definitive declaration of what my place in this family truly was. I could feel the cold air rushing in from outside, a stark contrast to the burning sting on my skin where the tiny, beautiful shards had decided to make their mark. But the most chilling part wasn't the blood. It was the silence that followed. They didn't move. They just watched. And in that moment, I finally understood this wasn't an accident. This was a choice. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. Eleanor always lived as if I were a story that was never meant to be told. They were the main cast in a grand theatrical play, with my parents and my younger brother, Thomas, as the central figures. I was simply the one standing in the wings, a ghost in my own home. We were seated at the dinner table, the rhythmic clinking of silverware against the fine china filling the silent gaps in their conversation. But it wasn't a true silence. It was a noise that belonged to them, the kind of quiet that only occurs when someone is deliberately being left out. The air was thick with the scent of roasted chicken and rosemary, a perfect backdrop for the casual cruelty that was about to unfold. The conversation, as it often did, turned to the summer house in Maine. It wasn't just a property to me. It was a sanctuary. It was the only place where I had ever felt truly seen and loved. My grandfather, a man of quiet strength and profound wisdom, had spent his final years there, teaching me about the delicate balance of nature and the importance of preserving what truly matters. He saw a part of me that my family had always overlooked: a quiet observer, a fierce protector of things unseen. I remember the countless hours we spent walking along the rugged coastline, him pointing out the different species of seabirds and the way the tide carved new patterns into the sand. He taught me about the hidden ecosystems in the tidal pools and the resilience of the ancient forests that hug the shore. He saw in me a kindred spirit, a soul who understood that true value wasn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the enduring legacy of a place. On his deathbed, he had held my hand and whispered, "Eleanor, promise me you'll protect this land. It's not about money, it's about legacy. It's about being true to yourself, even when no one else is watching." He had left the house to me in his will, not for its financial value, but for a higher purpose. He entrusted me with the land, with its ancient forests, to turn it into a nature preserve. It was my secret legacy, a promise I had made to him on his deathbed. But at that dinner table, the house was just another asset. My mother looked at me, her gaze passing through me as if I were a window, and spoke directly to Thomas. "I've told you already," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "Eleanor doesn't know what to do with it. It's just a burden." She used the word burden so matter-of-factly, right to my face, as if I were a piece of furniture that had worn out its welcome. Her words didn't sting. They felt like a cold, calculated confirmation of a truth I had always known. I held her gaze, a tempest raging inside me, a storm that had been brewing for years. My hands, hidden beneath the table, clenched into fists, my knuckles turning white. They had always treated me this way, as an afterthought, an inconvenience. My quiet nature was interpreted as weakness, my thoughtful silence as a lack of intelligence. I remembered a time when I was a little girl, so proud of a watercolor painting I had created of a single, vibrant maple leaf. I presented it to my mother, hoping for a word of praise. She glanced at it, then placed it on a stack of papers belonging to Thomas, who was building an elaborate diorama of a city. "That's lovely, dear," she said, her attention already elsewhere. "But look at Thomas. He's learning how to draw maps of the world." From that moment on, I understood that my small, quiet achievements would never measure up to Thomas's grandiose ambitions. I had learned to be silent, not out of weakness, but as a form of self-preservation. My silence was a shield, a fortress I built around my emotions. It allowed me to listen, to observe, and to understand the inner workings of their world, a world where love was a currency and I was perpetually in debt. I watched them, their faces a mask of feigned concern as they discussed the logistics of the sale. They spoke in hushed tones, as if discussing a classified mission, using words like liquidity, asset valuation, and capital gains. It was a foreign language to me, not because I didn't understand the terms, but because I saw the house as something beyond their comprehension. I tried to interject, to explain my connection to the house and my plans for its future, but my words were swallowed by the polished mahogany of the table. My father produced a detailed blueprint, not of a nature preserve, but of a subdivision. There were no trees, no wildlife, just the cold, sterile lines of what they intended to build. The document only had space for his name, my mother's, and Thomas's. "Sign here," my father instructed Thomas, his voice a low rumble of authority. "We'll get started once the paperwork is in order." Thomas's eyes flickered towards me, a fleeting moment of hesitation, but he said nothing. He had always been the golden child, the one who carried the weight of their expectations. He had learned to be a silent accomplice to their cruelty, to look away when I was being erased from the family narrative. They carried on as if I weren't even a part of the family, as if my name had been erased from their lineage and from the story of that house. The casual cruelty of their disregard wasn't new. It was a familiar ghost that haunted my memories. I stood up from the table, my plate still full, and quietly excused myself. I walked to my room, the familiar scent of old paper and dust greeting me. I opened the small, heavy safe that my grandfather had left for me. It was the only item from his estate that had come into my possession without a fight. I took out a faded scroll, its edges frayed with age, but the ink still strong. The signatures were clear and deliberate. It was a secret codicil to his will, granting me full ownership of the coastal land and its title, with the specific instruction that it be preserved for future generations. It was not a house to be sold, but a legacy to be protected. As I held the scroll, I felt a surge of power I had never known. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a shield, a sword. It was proof that my grandfather had seen a part of me they never had. I descended the stairs, the scroll held tightly in my hands, and found my parents arguing in the living room. My mother's voice was sharp and accusatory. "I told you, she's not smart enough to handle this," she exclaimed. My father's reply was a low growl, but he trusted her. They were so consumed by their argument that they didn't even see me standing in the doorway, the very object of their dispute held in my hands. The scroll wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a shield, a sword. It was proof that my grandfather had seen a part of me they never had. The atmosphere in the house was thick with tension. Thomas kept glancing at me, his eyes full of suspicion. He didn't know what I was holding, but he sensed that something was amiss. The dinner ended in a strained silence. I didn't say a word. I simply ate, savoring each bite of food, while they continued to discuss the sale of the house as if I were not in the room. My silence unsettled them. My mother, visibly irritated, finally broke the quiet. "Eleanor, aren't you going to say anything? I don't understand you." I remained silent. The pain had transformed into a quiet strength. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to explain. The pain had morphed into an unshakable patience. The next morning, an old friend of my grandfather's came to visit. He saw me standing in the hallway, and a warm smile spread across his face. "Eleanor, it's so good to see you," he said. "How is your grandfather's nature preserve coming along? He was so proud of you." My parents froze. My mother quickly interrupted him. "We're handling that. There have been some complications." My father's face went pale with rage. He turned to me, his eyes burning with a hatred I had never seen before. "Eleanor, we need to talk." When I turned to walk away, he shoved me. Not with full force, but just enough to make me lose my balance and fall into the glass door at the end of the hall. The glass shattered, not because of the force of the push, but because it was an old, fragile door. I lay among the broken shards, my hands and arms bleeding. My parents and Thomas just stood there, watching, not one of them moving to help me. I stood up, not needing their assistance. My gaze was not one of fear, but of cold, steely resolve. I held up the scroll. "I'm not selling it," I said. I stood up, not needing their assistance. My father, my mother, and Thomas just stood there, frozen. They didn't ask if I was okay. They simply stared, paralyzed with a mixture of disbelief and fury. The blood from the cuts on my hands dripped onto the pristine hardwood floor, creating small crimson pools. Their eyes were not filled with remorse, but with pure, unadulterated anger that I had dared to defy them and, in doing so, had broken their perfect facade. Their silence was deafening, a physical weight in the air that was heavier than the shattered glass beneath my feet. In that singular moment, I realized that my silence had become my most potent weapon. I didn't need to speak a single word, didn't need to offer an explanation. The truth had already made itself known. The fragile, old door that had been a silent witness to their cruelty had finally shattered, mirroring the cracks in our family. I picked up the scroll, its edges soft and worn from my grandfather's hands, and held it up. My gaze was no longer one of fear, but of cold, steely resolve. "I'm not selling it," I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence, a chilling statement of fact. It was a truth they could not deny, a reality they had tried to bury for years. I turned my back on them and walked away. The crunch of the glass under my boots was a satisfying sound, a final, defiant farewell. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I got into my car, the keys cold and familiar in my hand, and drove away. The old house, a prison of my past, shrank in the rearview mirror until it was just a dot on the horizon. I didn't need to apologize. I didn't need to explain. They would forever be left with my silence and the knowledge that I had had everything from the very beginning. The legal process was a cold, bureaucratic affair, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil I had left behind. With the secret codicil in hand, I had all the leverage I needed. The will was a masterpiece of my grandfather's cunning, designed to protect the land and, more importantly, to ensure it stayed with the person he trusted. My parents, in their arrogance, had never bothered to read the full document, only the parts they thought were relevant to them. They were so blinded by greed that they completely missed the sections that transferred the full ownership of the coastal property and all its associated trusts to me. The very investment funds they were using to finance the sale of the house were part of a hidden trust that my grandfather had established in my name years ago. The lawyers were stunned. My parents were left with nothing. My life now is a tapestry of peace and quiet, a world away from the constant noise and validation seeking of my past. I have fulfilled my promise to my grandfather and have turned the main property into a thriving nature preserve. I spend my days walking through the ancient forests, listening to the quiet rustle of leaves and the gentle lapping of waves. I am no longer living in fear of being forgotten or underestimated. I am free. I have found my own path, my own purpose. The land is my sanctuary, and the work is my quiet rebellion. One day. The phone rang. It was Thomas. His voice was shaky, filled with an emotion I couldn't place. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry." I was silent. I didn't know what to say. I hadn't heard from him in years. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I'm sorry I didn't believe you." Tears streamed down my face. I had waited for this moment for so long, but when it came, I felt no sense of triumph, only a profound emptiness. I had spent so much time building a new life, a life without them, that I had no space left for the old one. My wounds had healed, but the scars were a constant reminder of the price of my freedom. I said, "Thomas, I forgive you," but I had no intention of returning. I had found my peace. I had found my worth. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I had everything. The quiet of my new life was a foreign concept, but one I embraced with every fiber of my being. After the legal battle, which was less of a fight and more of a cold, methodical dismantling of my family's power, I had severed all ties. The lawyers were stunned by my grandfather's foresight. He had created a complex web of trusts and corporations, all with a single purpose to ensure the land and its assets would fall into my hands and be used for its intended purpose. The total value, tucked away in accounts my parents never even knew about, was over $21 million. It wasn't a windfall. It was a quiet, deliberate transfer of power. They had no idea I had been managing these accounts for years, diligently growing the funds, all while they looked right through me. The house, the land, the legacy. It was all mine. I spent the next year in solitude, working tirelessly to transform the main property into the nature preserve my grandfather had envisioned. It wasn't just a project. It was my therapy. Every tree I planted, every trail I blazed, was a step away from my past. The cold, sterile lines of my father's blueprint were replaced with the organic, winding paths of a thriving ecosystem. My hands, once dripping with blood from the broken glass, were now stained with the rich, dark soil of the earth. I was building something real, something that would outlast their greed and their disdain. I wasn't just getting even. I was building a monument to my own self-worth. The first frost of the season brought with it a quiet melancholy. I stood on the porch, looking out at the snow piling up on the railing, and felt a profound sense of peace. The house was quiet, and the only sounds were the low hum of the heater and the gentle whispers of the wind. I walked through each room slowly, my hand tracing the edges of the door frames, the cool surface of the new glass door that I had personally installed. It was sturdy and strong, a physical barrier I had created to protect my new life. Every part of this house was intact because I had made it that way, step by step, without noise, without wasted motion. That evening, I received a phone call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something compelled me. It was Thomas. His voice was a thin, reedy echo of the confident young man I had once known. "Eleanor," he said, his voice shaky. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." I was silent. I didn't know what to say. He continued, "I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I'm sorry I didn't believe you." Tears streamed down my face. I had waited for this moment for so long. The part of me that was a little girl, so desperate for her brother's approval, felt a brief, stinging satisfaction. But it quickly faded, leaving behind a profound emptiness. I had spent so much time building a new life, a life without them, that I had no space left for the old one. My wounds had healed, but the scars were a constant reminder of the price of my freedom. I said, "Thomas, I forgive you." But the words felt hollow. They were not for him, but for myself. I had no intention of returning. I had found my peace. I had found my worth. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I had everything. My victory wasn't loud. It didn't need to shout. It was a quiet, deliberate, and final act of self-preservation. Revenge fades, but control lasts. I closed and locked the door behind me, the sturdy mechanism a final, definitive click. The house was warm. The snow continued to fall, burying the world outside in a blanket of pristine white. I knew I had hit every mark. Justice didn't need a witness. It just needed to be accurate, deliberate, and final. And standing there with the door locked and the house warm, I knew I had achieved it all in the most silent way possible. I walked away from the shattered glass in the stunned silence, my heart thumping a steady, resolute rhythm against my ribs. The car door clicked shut with a sense of finality, a sound that felt more powerful than any argument I had ever tried to have with them. I didn't look back as I drove away. The house, the place that had been both a home and a cage, became a small, insignificant dot in my rearview mirror. I felt a profound sense of relief, a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. My victory wasn't loud. It was a quiet, deliberate act of self-preservation. The legal battle that followed was less of a fight and more of a cold, methodical dismantling of their power. With the secret codicil in hand, my grandfather's foresight became a tangible, legal reality. He had created a complex web of trusts and corporations, all with a single purpose to ensure the land and its assets would fall into my hands and be used for its intended purpose, the total value. Tucked away in accounts my parents never even knew about, was over $21 million. It wasn't a windfall. It was a quiet, deliberate transfer of power. They had no idea I'd been managing these accounts for years, diligently growing the funds, all while they looked right through me. The house, the land, the legacy. It was all mine. My life now is a tapestry of peace and quiet, a world away from the constant noise and validation seeking of my past. I have fulfilled my promise to my grandfather and have turned the main property into a thriving nature preserve. I spend my days walking through the ancient forests, listening to the quiet rustle of leaves and the gentle lapping of waves. I am no longer living in fear of being forgotten or underestimated. I am free. The solitude is not a punishment, but a sanctuary I have built for myself. One day, the phone rang. It was Thomas. His voice was shaky, an echo of the confident young man I had once known. "Eleanor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry." I was silent. I didn't know what to say. He continued, "I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I'm sorry I didn't believe you." Tears streamed down my face. I had waited for this moment for so long. But when it came, I felt no sense of triumph, only a profound emptiness. I had spent so much time building a new life, a life without them, that I had no space left for the old one. My wounds had healed, but the scars were a constant reminder of the price of my freedom. I said, "Thomas, I forgive you." But the words felt hollow. They were not for him, but for myself. I had no intention of returning. I had found my peace. I had found my worth. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I had everything. The first frost of the season brought with it a quiet melancholy. I stood on the porch, looking out at the snow piling up on the railing, and felt a profound sense of peace. The house was quiet, and the only sounds were the low hum of the heater and the gentle whispers of the wind. I walked through each room slowly, my hand tracing the edges of the door frames. The cool surface of the new glass door that I had personally installed. It was sturdy and strong, a physical barrier I had created to protect my new life. Every part of this house was intact because I had made it that way, step by step, without noise, without wasted motion. It wasn't about getting even. It was about making sure no one could undo what I'd built. Revenge fades, control lasts. By evening, the snow had piled up on the porch railing. I stood in the doorway, looking out at the quiet street, then closed and locked the door behind me. Justice didn't need to shout. It didn't need to make a scene. It needed to be accurate, deliberate, and final. And standing there with the lock set and the house warm, I knew I'd hit every mark.